In 1922, a British archaeologist named Leonard Woolley cut into a mound in southern Iraq and found something that shouldn't have been possible to bury and forget. Dozens of women arranged in neat rows, dressed in gold and lapis lazuli, dead beside a queen whose name we know and whose story we don't. For 100 years, historians assumed they died willingly. Then scientists put their skulls under a CT scanner. What they found rewrote the ending. And it is only the beginning of what the bones of Sumerian women have been trying to tell us. Before we get to the pit, you need to understand the world it belonged to, because almost nothing about it makes sense at first glance. Somewhere around 6,000 years ago, in the marshy delta where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers spill into the Persian Gulf, a people we call the Sumerians built the first true cities the world had ever seen. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur, cities of mud brick and reed, baking under a merciless sun, laced together by canals and irrigated fields. In these cities, something happened that had never happened before. Writing was invented, the wheel was invented, the plow, the sailing boat, the law code, the school, the temple tower, the legal contract, the very concept of a receipt. Almost everything we now call civilization, the Sumerians touched first, with hands that left no names behind for most of the people who did the touching. Kings were named. Gods were named. Scribes, priests, and merchants were named, sometimes on the very same tablets that listed grain and livestock beside them. But the women who spun the wool, ground the barley, and raised the children of this new kind of society rarely appear in the record as individuals at all. And then, almost as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. By around 4,000 years ago, the Sumerian language was already dying. A few centuries later, no one spoke it at all. The cities kept standing, but new rulers moved in, speaking Akkadian, then Babylonian, then Assyrian. The Sumerians themselves became a kind of ghost, a people who survive only as ink pressed into clay by scribes who came after them. Here's the first real mystery, and it is a strange one. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It is not related to any other known language on earth. Not Arabic, not Hebrew, not Persian, not Turkish, nothing. It stands as alone as Basque stands alone in Europe. So for over a century, scholars have asked the same unanswered question. Who were these people, and where did they come from? Did they walk into southern Iraq from somewhere else, carrying a language that belonged to no family? Did they arrive by sea? Did they simply grow out of the marsh itself, descended from older hunters and fishers who never left? The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people. They carved statues with enormous inlaid eyes, staring out at something we can no longer see. They wrote about a distant homeland in the eastern mountains, a place called Arada, which may or may not have ever existed as a real location. None of it was proof. None of it settled anything. For 100 years, the Sumerians remained a civilization without an origin story anyone could verify. Which brings us back to the pit. Woolley had been digging for several seasons beneath a ruined ziggurat near the city of Ur, working his way down through layer after layer of collapsed brick, when he uncovered a ramp sloping into the earth. He followed it. At the bottom was a chamber, and the chamber was full of the dead. In the largest of these tombs, there were around 70 bodies. Most of them were women. They lay in careful rows, legs drawn up slightly, hands often resting near their faces, as if they had simply lain down to sleep in their finest clothes. And their clothes were extraordinary. Golden headdresses shaped like leaves and flowers, gowns threaded with lapis lazuli and silver, small drinking cups placed beside their hands. Nearby lay the famous lyres of Ur, their sound boxes carved into the shape of bulls' heads, the bones of the musicians who had once played them still resting against the instruments, frozen mid-gesture for over 4,000 years. At the head of it all lay a woman named Puabi. We know her name because it was carved into a cylinder seal found on her body, one of the only individuals in the entire cemetery identified with any certainty. She may have been a queen. She may have been a high priestess. She was buried on a wooden bier beneath a headdress of gold leaves and carnelian. And around her lay attendants who seemed to have been dressed almost as elaborately as she was, as though status followed you even into the grave you didn't choose. For decades, the accepted explanation was almost gentle, in a tragic sort of way. Woolley believed the attendants had taken poison willingly, or been given it, and simply drifted into unconsciousness before the tomb was sealed around them. The cups by their hands seemed to support this. It was a grim story, but a dignified one. Devoted servants, or perhaps devoted believers, following their ruler into the next world by choice. That story survived for almost 80 years. Then, in the 2000s, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania Museum ran CT scans on skulls recovered from the site, using imaging technology Woolley could never have dreamed of. And what the scans showed put an end to the poison theory for good. They found small, round punctures, fractures consistent with a sharp, heavy instrument driven into the skull with force, not swallowed, not inhaled, not chosen. The pattern matched a copper implement found nearby, a battle axe with a long spike on one end. the kind of object that has no place at a peaceful funeral. Some bodies even showed signs of having been heated and treated with substances like cinnabar, likely in an attempt to preserve them and pose them attractively before burial, as though appearance mattered even in death, perhaps especially in death for people whose only value to the historical record was decorative. So the picture changed. These were not devoted volunteers walking calmly into the afterlife. These were people who were killed, then dressed, then arranged, then buried beside a woman whose name survived while theirs did not. It is one of the most unsettling reversals in the history of archaeology, and it did not require a single strand of DNA to prove. It required nothing more than a modern hospital scanner and someone willing to look closely at what earlier generations had preferred to romanticize. That leaves an obvious question hanging in the air. If the bones can tell us this much just from their shape, what could they tell us if we could read what is written inside them cell by cell in the language of genetics itself? That question has driven one of the most difficult scientific pursuits in modern archaeology. And southern Iraq is, without exaggeration, one of the worst possible environments in which to attempt it. To put the difficulty in perspective, entire genomes have been recovered from bodies frozen in Siberian permafrost for tens of thousands of years, simply because cold acts as a kind of natural preservation chamber, slowing the chemical decay that eventually shreds a strand of DNA into fragments too small to read. Mesopotamia offers close to the opposite conditions. It is hot for most of the year, it floods seasonally, and the very irrigation systems that made Sumerian agriculture so successful also kept the ground consistently damp in ways that speed up the microbial breakdown of organic material. In a strange sense, the same environment that allowed Sumer to become the first great civilization on Earth is also the environment that has worked hardest for 4,000 years to erase the physical evidence of the people who lived there. Ancient DNA begins breaking down the moment an organism dies, and the process accelerates dramatically in heat. Sunlight destroys it. Humidity destroys it. The soil chemistry of a floodplain baked by a Mesopotamian sun for 4,000 years is, in genetic terms, almost a demolition machine. For decades, this meant something simple and frustrating. Ancient genomes could be recovered from cold, dry places, Siberian permafrost, European caves, even parts of Egypt, protected by unusually dry desert conditions. Southern Mesopotamia, the literal birthplace of writing and law and cities, remained largely silent. The very people who invented the record kept the least legible biological record of all. That has only begun to change recently, and even now the progress is slow and hard-won. Researchers discovered that the petrous bone, the dense, pyramid-shaped structure that houses the inner ear, preserves genetic material far longer than almost any other part of the skeleton because of how densely packed and protected it is. Using this bone, and increasingly refined methods for filtering out modern contamination from centuries of handling, storage, and excavation, scientists have slowly begun coaxing genuine ancient genomes out of the region. A pair of Neolithic farmers from a site called Nemrik in northern Iraq gave up the first genome-wide data ever published from an early Mesopotamian population. Samples from Bahrain and the Gulf Islands, from populations connected to Mesopotamian trade networks, have also been sequenced in recent years, proving that this kind of recovery is not impossible, just extraordinarily difficult. But here's the part of the story most retellings skip over, because it complicates the drama. As of right now, no ancient DNA has been successfully recovered from the death pit at Ur itself, not from Puabi, not from her attendants. The heat that likely helped kill some of the delicate materials in that tomb has also, so far, defeated every attempt to read the genetic code of the people buried inside it. There have been calls to try. There have been proposals to sample the remains using newer techniques. So far, the queen who ruled the beginning of this story in gold and lapis has refused, in a sense, to give up her genetic secrets. It is one of the last true silences in Mesopotamian archaeology, and it is worth sitting with, because it means everything else we are about to discuss comes from context around that silence, not from inside it. So where does the disturbing part of this story actually come from, if not from Puabi's own bones? It comes from a wider pattern, one seen again and again in ancient DNA studies from populations that live the way the Sumerians almost certainly lived, in agricultural, patriarchal, city-based societies across the ancient Near East and beyond. Here is the method. Every person carries two very different genetic threads passed down the generations. Mitochondrial DNA travels from mother to child, essentially unchanged, down an unbroken maternal line. The Y chromosome travels from father to son, unchanged, down an unbroken paternal line. By comparing how much these two threads vary across a buried population, scientists can reconstruct something. Written records almost never bother to record. They can reconstruct who stayed in one place and who was moved. In society after society studied this way, across Bronze Age Europe, across the ancient steppe, even in a remote population on the Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland, researchers have found the same striking pattern. The Y chromosomes cluster tightly. A small number of male lineages dominate a given area for centuries, sometimes longer, suggesting the men were born, lived, and died within the same small radius of land. The mitochondrial DNA tells a completely different story. It is scattered, varied, traceable to distant, unrelated regions. The conclusion researchers have drawn from this pattern, again and again in population after population, is that men tended to stay where they were born, inheriting land, status, and lineage, while women were the ones who moved, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through alliance. Sometimes, the evidence increasingly suggests, through something considerably less voluntary. This pattern has not yet been confirmed with hard genetic data from Sumer specifically. For the simple reason we just discussed, the DNA from the Great Tombs has not survived to be tested. But it does not need to come from the tombs alone to be relevant, because the written record from Sumer supplies something ancient DNA studies elsewhere often lack: direct, obsessive, bureaucratic documentation of exactly this kind of movement. The Sumerians recorded almost everything: grain shipments, beer rations, the names of temple officials, the size of fields, the breeding records of cattle, and again across thousands of surviving tablets from cities like Lagash and Umma, the movement and ownership of women. Women appear in these administrative lists alongside sheep, alongside grain, alongside copper, counted as part of the standard inventory of a palace or a temple economy. Many were assigned to weaving houses, where they spun and dyed the textiles that made Sumerian cities wealthy enough to build the very ziggurats their kings were buried beneath. Some of these women held a degree of status as temple dedicants. Many, the texts make clear, were not free at all. Words for captured or enslaved women appear repeatedly across surviving administrative archives. Some tablets even name the places these women came from: towns in the Zagros Mountains to the east, settlements along the upper Tigris, regions that, based on everything else we know about ancient population movement in this era, would have supplied exactly the kind of outside maternal lineages that genetic studies elsewhere associate with petrolocal, expansionist societies. In other words, even without a single genome from inside the royal tombs, the surviving written record of Sumer already describes, in its own dry bureaucratic language, a civilization that treated the movement of women as a resource to be tracked, counted, and administered in the same breath as livestock. Whether every individual buried around Puabi arrived in Ur through capture, tribute, trade, or marriage, we may never know for certain from her tomb alone. But we know the machinery for exactly that kind of movement existed, was normalized, and was written down without apparent embarrassment because, to the scribes who recorded it, it was simply how the economy worked. It is worth pausing here to talk about the women who left no golden headdress behind at all, because the story of ordinary Sumerian women, pieced together not from royal tombs, but from common cemeteries scattered across the region, is in some ways even harder to sit with than the death pit itself. Bone chemistry can reveal, with remarkable precision, what a person ate across the years of their life. Different diets leave distinct chemical signatures in tooth enamel and in bone collagen, signatures that persist for millennia. When researchers have examined skeletal remains from ordinary Mesopotamian cemeteries, away from the wealth of the royal tombs, a consistent pattern emerges. Women, across many sites and many centuries, show more signs of nutritional stress during childhood than the men buried beside them, sometimes in the very same households. More interruptions in bone growth, more dental defects associated with periods of illness or hunger. Food, even inside the same family, inside the same home, does not appear to have been distributed evenly. None of this required an accusation written on a tablet to become visible. It is simply what the bones themselves report. Decades of small, repeated inequities accumulating quietly across a lifetime until they leave a permanent signature in dental enamel and bone density, a signature no scribe ever needed to record, because the body was already keeping the account on its own. The consequences of this shortfall are visible in how long these women lived. Skeletal age estimates from Sumerian-era cemeteries consistently show women dying younger than men, often in their 20s. A significant number show clear evidence of death during or shortly after childbirth, sometimes visible in the skeleton itself as fetal bones preserved within the mother's pelvis, a single grave holding two lives that ended together. Others carry the marks of infections that modern medicine would treat without a second thought: tuberculosis, waterborne parasites, the after effects of drinking unboiled milk in a hot, crowded city with no understanding of germ theory. This was not a world with modern medicine, so it should surprise no one that both men and women died young by today's standards. But the gap between how the sexes fared, in food, in survival, in the visible wear on their bones, was not equal. And the cemeteries do not let that inequality hide. The children make it worse. In cemetery after cemetery across the region, the single most common grave belongs not to an adult, but to an infant. Estimates drawn from the proportion of small skeletons in these burial grounds suggest that something close to 1 in every 3 children did not survive past the age of 5. In some locations, the number appears to be even higher. These small graves are frequently found close to the remains of adult women, women whose own skeletons often carry the physical markers of repeated pregnancy, changes to the pelvis, to the joints, to bone density from prolonged periods of breastfeeding without adequate nutrition to support it. Taken together, the picture that emerges from ordinary graves is very different from the Golden Queen on her cylinder seal. It is the picture of a woman moved from her birthplace, often quite young, married into a household that was not originally hers, working long hours at a loom, fed less generously than the men around her, bearing children again and again in conditions that killed a significant fraction of them in infancy, and often dying herself before the age of 30. There is one more thread in this story worth pulling gently, because it involves the smallest, most elite slice of Sumerian society, the royal and priestly families whose burials produced the wealth Woolley uncovered in the first place. In several ancient civilizations, where royal power depended on keeping bloodlines pure and inheritances undivided, close kin marriage was practiced, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. It is well documented among the later pharaohs of Egypt. It is documented in the Inca royal family. It appears in some Persian aristocratic households. Whether Sumerian dynasties practiced anything similar remains genuinely uncertain, since, again, the genetic evidence that would settle the question with confidence has not yet been recovered from Sumer's own royal burials. What can be said, honestly, is that the same pressures that produced this pattern elsewhere, a small ruling class determined to concentrate power and property within a narrow bloodline, were clearly present in Sumerian society as well, visible in its steep hierarchies and its careful, almost obsessive record-keeping around inheritance and lineage. If elite intermarriage did occur here the way it did elsewhere, the burden of it would have fallen overwhelmingly on the women involved, who, in societies of this kind, rarely had any real choice in who they married, regardless of how close that relation might have been. It is worth being honest about the limits of what we can currently claim on this particular point. Unlike the diet and mortality evidence, which comes from direct physical measurement of many skeletons across many sites, the question of close kin marriage among Sumerian royalty remains, for now, an informed inference drawn from comparison with other ancient dynasties, rather than a conclusion drawn from Sumerian genetic data itself. Future recovery of DNA from royal burials elsewhere in the region could confirm it, complicate it, or overturn it entirely, and that uncertainty is itself part of the honest story of this field. Out of everything we have discussed so far, one Sumerian woman managed something no one else in this story achieved. She left her own name behind, in her own words, in her own voice. Her name was Enheduana. She lived around 4,300 years ago, the daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, and she served as high priestess of the moon god Nana in the city of Ur, the very city where Puabi would later be buried in gold. Enheduana wrote hymns to the goddess Inanna that survive today on clay tablets copied and recopied by scribes for centuries after her death, which is itself a remarkable act of preservation in a world that so rarely bothered to preserve women's words. She is, as far as the written record shows, the first author in human history whose name we actually know, male or female, from any civilization on Earth. In her surviving poetry, she wrote about exile. She wrote about injustice. She wrote strikingly about being silenced in a temple system controlled by men, a theme that reads almost unbearably relevant against everything else this story has uncovered. Some scholars believe her remains may still lie somewhere in the unexcavated soil of Ur, unidentified, waiting for exactly the kind of genetic technology that has so far failed to reach Puabi's tomb. If they are ever found and successfully tested, it would be one of the great ironies of this entire field that the one Sumerian woman who insisted on being remembered in her own words might finally also be heard through her own DNA. Behind Enheduana, there were millions of women whose names simply do not exist in any surviving record. They are visible to us now only as bone density, as tooth enamel, as the careful rows of a death pit, as a line item on a clay tablet listing them beside grain and copper. For most of the last century, that was as much as anyone could say about them. They were present in the story of the world's first civilization, clearly essential to how it functioned, and almost completely absent from how it chose to describe itself. That absence is starting slowly to close, not because Puabi's own DNA has finally spoken, because it hasn't, but because science is now approaching the civilization from every possible angle at once, comparing skeletons across cemeteries, sequencing genomes from neighboring regions and earlier periods, rereading administrative tablets with fresh eyes, and rescanning old bones with new machines. Each of these methods on its own tells only a fragment of the story. Put together, they begin to sketch the outline of something the Sumerians themselves never intended to leave behind, an honest picture of what life actually cost the women who built their cities, wove their cloth, raised their children, and in at least one recorded case, buried her own silencing into verse so beautifully that it survived 4,000 years just to be read by us tonight. Interestingly, the genetic traces associated with the wider population of ancient southern Mesopotamia do not appear to have persisted unchanged through later history. As new empires rose in the same cities, Babylonian, Assyrian, and eventually others, the genetic profile of the people living there gradually shifted, layer upon layer, the way populations everywhere shift over enough centuries. Some researchers studying present-day communities in the marshlands of southern Iraq, in the very wetlands where Uruk and Ur first rose from the mud, have found traces of unusually old regional ancestry persisting there today, a faint thread connecting the modern residents of that landscape to the deep past beneath their feet. It is not proof of an unbroken Sumerian bloodline reaching into the present, and no serious researcher claims it is, but it is a reminder that even after a language dies, even after a civilization's name becomes a word found only in museums and textbooks, something of the people who lived it can still linger in the land they never really left. So we return, finally, to the pit beneath the ziggurat, and to the woman who watched over it as its queen or its priestess. We know her name. We do not know, in any genetically certain sense, where she truly came from, who her mother was, or whether the golden women arranged around her in death were daughters of the same city or captives, brought from somewhere far away and never allowed to go home. What we do know from a CT scanner, from cuneiform tablets, from cemetery after cemetery of ordinary graves, from genetic patterns recovered in neighboring regions, and from the surviving voice of one extraordinary priestess who refused to stay silent, is enough to tell us this, even without a single strand of DNA yet drawn from the pit itself. The story Sumer told about itself, in stone and gold and careful clay inscriptions, was never the whole story. It was, at best, half of it, written by the half of the population that held the stylus. The other half is only now, slowly, painfully, and still incompletely, beginning to be heard, not because they finally spoke, but because we finally learned how to listen to what their bones, their graves, and their absence from the record had been telling us all along.